Thank you for being here. Two questions. Just wanted to find out what the interest was in First Nations communities of growing cannabis. You hear about a whole bunch of other ones outside Brampton and Smiths Falls, Ontario, and so on and so forth. I'd like to know that, because I don't know of any specific names. And also under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, you're calling for respect the right of Indigenous communities to establish their own cannabis and taxation laws. It's a free market that we live in. So if taxation laws, if the First Nations community put a tax in which is basically an excise tax, which is known as a sin tax, whatever, that puts that in there beyond the other taxes that are there, and therefore the cannabis is cheaper. It might be lower, it could be higher, it could be prohibitive to put it too high, and I don't know which way it would go. Do you have any comments on in a free market that we live in, and we seem to have a difficult time selling beer across the border?
This Senator was, as the chair said, we were very keen to put some kind of an amendment forward that would include Indigenous people in Indigenous governments in the excise tax regime. That was the proposal that came from the First Nations Tax Commission, which is a federally funded organization that's been around and very credible, that they be included. We're not allowed in the Senate to make those kind of things, otherwise we'd have made it. And that's one of the reasons why we think the coming into force delay will allow the federal government to do what they ought to have done before, because as that commissioner pointed out, we are headed down with this bill the exact same road that we went with cigarettes, where we had gray markets that populated themselves on Indigenous communities near the border, and eventually it took us many, many years to get that all sorted out, and some significant tension. We're not learning from that, and it probably, in my mind, was the biggest evidence that the lack of consultation was there, that there was not consultation. Somebody would have picked this up way sooner. With respect to economic development, this is why we have the amendment in there. We heard from a number of Indigenous community leaders and from business leaders, that they are keen to be part of this. And let's face it, this is one of the largest business bonanzas that has come from nowhere. I mean, that we're going to go from zero in the legitimate market to somewhere around $7 billion a year in legitimate enterprise. That doesn't happen very often. And First Nations communities, Aboriginal communities, are not ramped up in the same way that other parts of the market are. And so to provide them, our recommendation, to provide them with a cut of the licenses and allow that development to occur, we think makes a lot of sense.
And if I could just add to that, I think it also speaks to the issue of the right to self-government. Self-governing nations should be allowed their own taxation regimes, and at this point in time, the excise tax agreements have only been made with the provinces and territories, not with First Nations. And if you want First Nations to get ahead, then you also have to provide them with equal opportunity for the economic opportunities that arise.
If I may, one of the witnesses very clearly outlined that the purpose of developing Indigenous laws, even on taxation or even sharing in the present excise tax sharing agreement, was so some of those revenues can be invested back into First Nations to deal with public education, to deal with the lack of mental health services and treatment centers, and even just providing infrastructure that can support some cannabis producers in their territory. So it wasn't this doing taxation just for the sake of doing taxation. The whole purpose behind it was for Indigenous communities to be able to take those new revenues and invest them back into the communities to deal with some of the adverse effects that may arise as a result of C-45.
Thank you. Okay.